Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling crime and deviance. Always good for a lively debate, right? You've given us some sources on two perspectives on crime, right realism and left realism. Should be interesting to unpack this.
It really is remarkable, how these two schools of thought can look at the same issue and come to such different conclusions about how to address it.
It's like they're looking at different puzzle pieces, but they're all mixed up from the same box.
Yeah.
So where do we even begin with these two perspectives?
Well, a good place to start is with right realism. It emerged back in the 1970s and 80s. It was a time of conservative politics, with Reagan and Thatcher, a lot of anxiety about rising crime rates, especially street crime.
It was the era of tough on crime policies, right?
Yeah.
Was right realism a product of that climate, or did it contribute to it? Or maybe both.
Oh, definitely a product of that climate, right?
Right.
Realists saw crime as a serious problem, and they thought that theories that focused on the reasons people commit crimes were missing the point.
So instead of looking at poverty or inequality as root causes, what did they focus on?
They focused on, well, a few things. First, biological factors. Like some people are just more likely to commit crimes because they're aggressive.
Didn't they also talk about intelligence? I feel like that's a controversial area.
Yeah, there was some talk about intelligence and criminality with people like Wilson and Herrnstein, but you can imagine that got a lot of pushback.
So that's nature. What about nurture? Did they address that at all?
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
Socialization was huge for them. They were big on the traditional family structure, the nuclear family, having two parents, especially a father.
The idea being that without that stability and those role models, kids are more likely to go down the wrong path.
Exactly. They believed that breakdown of the family led to kids not learning discipline, morals, respect for authority. That's where Charles Murray comes in with his ideas about the underclass.
I've heard that term but never really understood it. What did he mean by underclass?
Well, Murray argued that there was this segment of society that was stuck in a cycle of poverty and deviance, and he blamed it in part on what he called the generous revolution, basically the welfare state.
He thought welfare, instead of helping, was actually keeping people trapped.
Yeah, he argued that it disincentivized work, made people reliant on the government, undermined the family. And it was a view that a lot of conservatives at the time really latched onto.
So we've got biology, family breakdown, and then there's the whole rational choice element. How did that fit into their worldview?
So rational choice theory, think Ronald Clark here, basically says that people make a calculated decision when they commit a crime. They weigh the pros and cons, the potential rewards versus the risk of getting caught.
So if it seems like the reward outweighs the risk, they're more likely to go for it.
Exactly, right? Realists believe that in a lot of cases, the risks just weren't high enough to deter people from committing crimes.
Which is what led them to advocate for those tough on crime policies. Make it much riskier to even think about breaking the law.
You got it. They were all about control, punishment, deterrence, more police, harsher sentences, longer prison terms, making it physically harder to commit crimes. Target hardening.
Like putting bars on windows and security systems everywhere?
Yep, exactly. And it's a strategy that definitely had its critics. A lot of people pointed out that it didn't address the social and economic factors that lead to crime, and that it could actually end up disproportionately harming marginalized communities. Which brings us to the rise of left realism, but we can unpack that after a quick break.
So before the break, we were talking about those criticisms of right realism, how it didn't really address the root causes of crime. And that's where left realism comes in.
So it was kind of a reaction to right realism, saying, hey, there's more to this story.
Exactly. Left realists weren't saying crime wasn't a problem. They were just saying that the right realist solutions were too simplistic. They thought we need to be tough on crime, even tough on the causes of crime.
But they weren't just echoing those traditional Marxist views, were they? Weren't there some key differences? Yeah, they were rooted in some of those ideas, but they also broke with traditional Marxism in some pretty important ways. Like Marxists tended to focus on the crimes of the powerful, corporate greed, exploitation. But left realists were more concerned with the everyday crimes that affect regular people, the stuff that makes people feel unsafe in their communities.
So things like robbery, assault, vandalism, what we typically call street crime.
Right, exactly. They argued that those street crimes were being ignored and that working class communities were the ones who were suffering the most. They were both the victims and the perpetrators of these crimes.
Okay, so they were trying to find a middle ground, acknowledging that crime was a real problem, especially for working class people, but also trying to understand why people in those communities might turn to crime in the first place.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It was about understanding the social conditions that create criminals. So they were asking, why would someone who's struggling, who knows that crime is wrong, still choose to commit a crime? What pushes them to that point?
Is it as simple as poverty? Do they just say, well, poor people commit crimes because they're poor?
It's more complicated than that. Poverty plays a role, but they introduced this idea of relative deprivation.
Relative deprivation. So it's not just about being poor, it's about feeling
We
poor.
got it. It's about how you see yourself compared to others. You might not be poor in an absolute sense, you have a roof over your head, food on the table. But if you're surrounded by people who have much more than you can still feel deprived.
Especially in our social media age, right? Where everyone is constantly showcasing their wealth and perfect lives.
Exactly. It's like, you see all these images of wealth and success, and it makes you feel like you're falling behind. That can create resentment, frustration, even anger. And that can, in some cases, lead to crime.
It's like that pressure to keep up with the Joneses, but it can have more serious consequences than just overspending on a new car.
Right. And it ties into another concept that left realists talk about, marginalization. That feeling of being excluded, of not having a voice, of not belonging, like the system is rigged against you.
It's not just about material wealth, it's about feeling like you're a part of society.
Absolutely. And left realists also pointed to the effects of globalization. They argued that it was making these problems of relative deprivation and marginalization even worse.
But doesn't globalization create more opportunities? I mean, more trade, more jobs.
Well, in theory, yes. But in practice, it's more complicated. While globalization created opportunities for some, it also led to job losses in certain sectors, especially in manufacturing. So you have people who are losing their jobs, feeling left behind, and seeing others prospering. That creates a lot of tension.
So you have this combination of factors: economic hardship, social exclusion, and a sense that the system is unfair. It's not hard to see how that could lead to crime. So what did left realists propose we do about it? If right realists were all about punishment, what solutions did they offer?
Well, first of all, they were critical of those zero-tolerance policies that the right realists were pushing. They thought they were heavy-handed, often discriminatory, and didn't really work in the long run.
So instead of cracking down harder, they wanted to address those root causes that we were talking about.
Exactly. They wanted to prevent crime from happening in the first place by addressing the underlying social and economic problems. So they were advocating for things like police reform, making sure that the police were more accountable to the community, more representative of the community, and focused on building trust instead of just being an occupying force.
So building better relationships between law enforcement and the communities they serve.
Right. They also talk a lot about social justice and economic equality. They believed that if we want to reduce crime, we need to create a fairer and more just society.
That's a pretty ambitious goal. I mean, was that even seen as realistic, or was it just too idealistic?
Well, it definitely faced criticism. Some people argued that it was unrealistic, that it was just a utopian dream. But left realists said that if we don't at least try to create a more just society, then we're just accepting the status quo.
So they were pushing for big systemic change, not just small tweaks to the system.
Exactly. They believe that everyone has a role to play in making society safer. It wasn't just about the police or the government. It was about communities coming together, working together to create a better future.
That sounds like a very community-oriented approach. Did they give any specific examples of how that could work in practice?
Yeah, for example, they talked about restorative justice. That's a system that focuses on repairing the harm that's been done by a crime, rather than just punishing the offender.
So instead of just throwing someone in jail, you try to bring the victim and the offender together to talk about what happened and try to find a way to heal and move forward.
That's the idea. It's about accountability, but also about forgiveness and reconciliation. But of course, like any theory, left realism has its critics too. One of the biggest criticisms came from feminist scholars. They argued that left realism didn't really account for the role of gender in crime.
So they felt it didn't adequately address things like domestic violence or sexual assault or the unique challenges that women face in the criminal justice system.
Exactly. They felt that left realism, while well-intentioned, still had a bit of a blind spot when it came to gender.
Which just goes to show that even theories that challenge the status quo can still have their own limitations, right?
Absolutely. It's a good reminder that we always need to be critical thinkers, to question our assumptions, and to be open to different perspectives.
So it seems like we've got these two very different ways of looking at crime, right? Realism and left realism. What would you say are the biggest takeaways from our deep dive into this? Well, I think it's important to remember that right? Realism came about at a specific time. A time when people were really anxious about crime, and there was this shift towards conservative politics. So it makes sense that they focus on individual responsibility and tougher law enforcement as solutions.
Right. And then left realism comes along and says, hold on, you're missing a big part of the picture.
Exactly. They said you can't ignore those social and economic factors that contribute to crime. You can't just punish your way out of the problem.
It's interesting, though, that they were both grappling with the same question. How do we make society safer?
Yeah, at the end of the day, I think that's the common thread. But their answers were very different. And that's why it's so important to understand both perspectives. It's not about picking a side, right realism or left realism. It's about taking a more nuanced view.
So what does that mean for the average person? We're not all criminologists or policymakers. How can we apply this to our own lives? I think the main takeaway is that we all need to be more critical thinkers. When you hear about a crime, it's easy to just jump to conclusions, to blame the individual or to blame the system.
Right, depending on your own political leaning.
Exactly. But these theories encourage us to look beyond those easy answers, to ask ourselves what factors might have led to that crime, and what can we do individually and collectively to address those factors.
So it's not just about being informed, it's about taking action.
Absolutely. We need to move beyond these simplistic solutions, the tough on crime versus the soft on crime rhetoric. It's much more complicated than that. We need to recognize that punishment has its place, but so does prevention. And we need to be willing to challenge our own assumptions and biases, especially when it comes to things like poverty, inequality, and discrimination.
This deep dive has really given me a lot to think about. Any final thoughts for our listeners?
I would just say, think about your own community. Think about your own experiences and how these theories might apply. Look around and see what factors contribute to safety and security in your community. And ask yourself what role you can play in making your community a safer and more just place for everyone.
That's great advice. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time, keep those brains engaged.